Hello and welcome to Arts Chat. Today I am speaking with General Director and Artistic Director Robert Lyall, who is going to be conducting the upcoming production of Madame Butterfly. Robert, thank you for talking today.
My pleasure.
I want to start with asking you, when you decide to schedule Madame Butterfly, one of the most popular operas of all time,
Right.
how do you do it?
Well, the first thing you must address is the butterfly herself. You know, this is a very specific case in verismo opera where you have some details that need attention. Ideally, you find a Japanese dramatic soprano, and there are several that have made their living singing this role repeatedly. And in my career, I have conducted it with Japanese sopranos, Korean sopranos, Chinese sopranos, of course, numerous American sopranos and Italian sopranos, and a French soprano. So the makeup can address a lot of the issue, but there is something about the character, its vulnerability, the social customs of Japan, in stark contrast to the Western customs of America and our respective personalities, the forwardness, the ease, the frankness of an American compared to the inscrutability and the reserve of an Oriental personality.
Right.
That can help address the differences on the stage. But you start with the idea of who is the best Cio-Cio-san. It's also compounded by the fact that early in the opera we are made very aware that she is 15 years old.
Right.
So there's something about the carriage of a younger person and the carriage of an older person that needs to be considered. How does that person move? How do they look as a teenager that is recently a geisha, in the honorable sense of what a geisha was, just an entertainer, not anything suggesting sexual matters. But simply a girl who came from a family who fell on hard times, whose father was some kind of official who was invited to commit suicide by the Mikado. And now the family is on hard times, and she has chosen a course that many women during wartime periods and the stationing of sailors, soldiers, and others in their countries address, and that is, should they marry them? Should they change their culture? And in this case, it's made the more flagrant in the sense that the American tenor, the Pinkerton, says this is for him a fling. For her, it is a lifetime commitment. That reaches the very depths of her being, because we find that in addition to the marriage ceremony itself, she has gone to the temple and renounced Buddhism and become a Christian. So it's one of the most sympathetic characters. Cio-Cio-san is one of the most sympathetic characters that Puccini created, but not without his own problems. Now, you've asked me a question of where do you start, and I've said, well, let's start with the soprano, because that's a tough one. It's a big sing for a soprano, and certainly for a young soprano. So it is of necessity that one do a lot of acting, because the women who have the vocal equipment to scale the great dramatic heights of these arias, particularly in the last act, are not young singers. And often they need the physical stature that can support the kind of instrument that you need to sing this.
Absolutely.
But, you know, occasionally you find the perfect Cio-Cio-san, someone that looks youthful, someone that sounds youthful, and yet has the vocal prowess and power to sing Tutto Piccolo e Dio and Un Bel Dio with full volume against a very rich orchestration. So I start with Cio-Cio-san. Then next I move to the tenor. And again, you want someone that's young, handsome, brash, that has a nonchalance about their carriage on stage and their style of delivery. It's Italian melodrama, regardless of what Puccini thought he was creating originally. And you want someone that has that beautiful liquescence in the voice, the beautiful colorings of the Italian repertoire. And and strike a balance between what the Cio-Cio has vocally and the Pinkerton vocally, because they sing one of the longest duets in opera at the end of the first act, 18 minutes of two people out there making glorious music together. And they need to have a kind of chemistry that we believe in.
Right.
And so there are at least a few requirements in that regard. Young, dashing, handsome, brash, and extroverted in his nonchalance about the drama that he is about to create. Next is...
But let me ask you a question on Pinkerton. Do you think, that they're interesting for both Butterfly and Pinkerton, that these are both interpretations of an American and a 15-year-old Japanese girl through a late 19th century Italian man's perception?
Oh, it goes even deeper than that. If you get to the John Long short story on which this is based, and then David Belasco's play based on the short story, which was then picked up by an Italian composer. And so you have the multinational approach that all circulates around the West's interpretation of the East.
Absolutely.
You see, and so when we write about cultures that we're not intimately familiar with, what are likely to be the miscues? And much has been written about both Long and Belasco's trivializing of some of the characters by reducing their speech to just kind of pidgin talk, pidgin English kinds of things, in an effort to sound authentic. Well, put that now in the hands of one of the great theatrical geniuses, Puccini, and he struggled enormously with this because he felt that at the time of the creation of this, which was 1903, 1904, it premiered in February of 1904 in La Scala, matters of the Orient were considered very exotic in Europe.
Absolutely.
And so people loved anything that had to do with China and Japan and places like that. They just seemed like they were another planet almost. And so Puccini, who was a great student of drama, decided that he would really try to find out what it took to create an opera about Japan or Japanese characters. So he engaged in some kind of almost overkill in the sense that he wanted it to be so authentic that he read about Japanese rituals, he read about cultural issues, and then he tried to incorporate all of those elements in his opera, forgetting that at its heart he was writing an Italian melodrama.
Absolutely.
And so he weighted the piece down with so much detail and so many elements that the Butterfly hardly took flight. And in fact it was booed off the stage at its opening night, and that was very, very rare for Puccini, who had come out of a series of triumphant premieres and was easily established as the heir apparent of the great Verdi, was the greatest Italian composer on the planet by all estimations. And yet he came up with this bomb, and the bomb was as a result of too much information. Just simply, when you come to one of the famous moments in the opera where she chooses to take her own life, in the original version, Puccini added every element that he had ever read about how a person commits hara-kiri, and it just stopped the drama. And that was just one of many things. And there were minor character developments that were woefully disproportionate to the needs of the piece. And some of the greatest music was actually assigned to some of the minor characters that in his many versions he later redistributed. And
how many versions were there?
There were five versions in the period from 1904. The sequence went like this, Todd. It was premiered in February at La Scala and literally booed off the stage. Puccini withdrew it after the first performance, returned the commission, said, "I have not written a piece worthy of this great stage." He rewrote the piece, took it in from 2 acts, divided it into 3 acts, made some other important changes, and performed it in Brescia, an important medium-sized house, in May of 1904. And that was a big success. He was on the right path. But then he took it to Paris and he took it to New York, and it was performed in Washington, D.C., first in the United States, but first in Paris, and more revisions made, then taken to the United States and given in Washington and then New York, and then revised yet again, each one of these major productions creating a new revision, and then revised again for the fifth time in 1907 and given at the Metropolitan Opera. And then, even after that, a few refinements that gave us the masterpiece that we know and love today as one of the greatest operas ever written.
Wow.
But such a difficult birthing
Right.
process, even for someone that was as closely attentive to details of the stage as Puccini was, who used to travel around Europe incognito and sit in the halls and watch his pieces being performed to see the impact that they made.
Really?
And yet, so many miscalculations with Butterfly, for it to end up after having so much stripped out, simplified, realigned, and now it is one of the most frequently performed operas in the
Absolutely.
world.
When we talked about Butterfly and Pinkerton, now let's go on to Sharpless and Suzuki.
Well, Suzuki is an interesting character. She is a servant. She came with the house, so to speak, when he
Right.
bought the Sochi for 999 years' rent, as he proudly announces
Right.
at the beginning of the opera. The household servants came with it, and Suzuki. And Suzuki is transformed in the course of this into the confidant and almost the sister. She's both a mother figure and a sister to Cio-Cio. Now, imagine that you are an older woman who is a manager, so to speak, of the household, and your new mistress is a 15-year-old geisha who has been abandoned now by her American husband, as we find at the top of Act. Or he returned to America with little or no intention of ever returning.
Right.
And the older, wiser woman is aware of this. Clearly, from the conversation that opens the second act, we know that she has been informing Cio-Cio, do not hold your breath. He's highly unlikely to return. This has happened so many times in the culture when you're the occupied country and that kind of thing. So she's an interesting character to watch. It's a role that's made up of millions of little details. As I say, her role's all about the teacups and moving
Right.
the props and setting the scene for various things. But she is truly a creation of Japanese culture. And she moves comfortably through these stages of development, from just being a household servant to being the mother figure, the sister figure, and finally the ultimate confidant at the end, where she is the one who has the heavy burden of telling Cio-Cio, they've come to take your child. Sharpless is the father figure in the opera, if you will. He's should be, I think, played as an older American field agent who's a career diplomat. He's been stationed there, and he too has seen a lot of this. The original version of the play and the opera had a scene in which Cio-Cio actually goes to Sharpless's office to inquire about Pinkerton, and the issue of the reading of the letter and the correspondence and contacts with America and with Pinkerton take place more on American soil. And that's one of those miscalculations that Puccini later corrected into what is truly a touching scene in the opera, where Sharpless comes up the mountainside yet again with letter in hand and says, "Madame Butterfly, I'm here to talk to you about your husband." Of course, she misinterprets everything he says to be optimistic and positive. The contact has been made. But it tells you a lot about the nature of the character of Sharpless, that from the very beginning, he says, "Badate si credete," be cautious because she believes you. So Pinkerton sings Dunque al mondo, and that's basically a paean of the male ego, saying the girl in every port is what all men seek. And as I travel the world as an American sailor, I'm going to have that girlfriend, and now I'm in the here and now, and I will have my Japanese bride as if she's a plaything, certainly a diversion for his tenure. And then I'm going to go home and have my true American bride. And upon hearing this, Sharpless says, that's an easy philosophy. I'm not sure you fully appreciate the wake of sorrow and destruction that you leave in your path.
Absolutely.
And Pinkerton, like any brash young man, just said, don't worry, it'll be okay. America forever.
Right.
And what the only thing that binds these two men, the only thing is that they are both Americans on foreign soil. But Pinkerton is just a passing figure of this insouciance. Sharpless has lived among the Japanese. He knows the sensitivities. He realizes what Pinkerton is doing. He cautions him, be careful. She really believes all of these comments about love and believes she's in this forever. And of course it comes back to haunt Pinkerton in the closing scene. And Sharpless becomes pivotal in that regard. So I in casting, look for an older, very American-looking male, but somebody who's a very sympathetic character. You know, I've conducted productions where the stage director pushes it toward the Americans turn cold to the issue of Cio-Cio-san. There's nothing of that in the score. It's all about Sharpless says, I told you, now look what you've done. And as you know, Kate Pinkerton, the American wife that comes back at the closing moments to claim the child, even says, perdonate, Cio-Cio-san. You know, she begs for forgiveness, that she has to do a thing that any woman, I would think, would find to be almost impossible. And that is to take another woman's child and say, I think I'm doing this for the betterment of the child. You live here in poverty with little hope for the future for this child, and we can provide something that you cannot. But still, it is a woman who is faced with the onerous duty of saying, we've come to take this child and make it our own because it's my husband's child. So it's, you want a Kate Pinkerton that can play that moment with a great sensitivity, because, you know, it's built into the piece, but it is, it requires a bit of care so that when we turn the corner into the darker moments where Cio-Cio-san accepts this, but she's also making a decision. She's making two decisions. She says, number one, I'll do this, but tell Pinkerton he must come see me. And of course what she's going to do is plan her own suicide and stage the theatrics of that so that when he comes through the door, he will see the horrors of what he's created. So as you think through the piece and where it leads us, I often jokingly say, I'm sure women view this opera very differently than men do. On the other hand, I don't think that there's any person with a heart and any sensitivity to the pain and suffering of others that doesn't walk away with that truly cathartic experience of theater, that you have traveled some distance with these people. And the Puccini, who was accused of sentimentality in his writings, when people would say, well, how can you compare the great Puccini with the greater Verdi? Because Verdi wrote epics, Verdi wrote monumental works, he wrote important works of church and state. Puccini writes sentimental pieces. And that famous comment by Puccini that l'opera è fatto di piccolo così. Opera is made up of little things. And he was certainly the master of that kind of detail, that kind of tinta, if you will. And Butterfly, in that respect, is so much more complete in its details than even his other greatest works, Tosca being the most verismo opera I think ever written as far as attention to details. But they're of a different kind because you still have the church and state and a grander backdrop.
Definitely.
You know, where you've got Baron Scarpia and you've got invocations of the name of the Queen and you've got executions. This is all about what happens in a small little house of 2 rooms. And so, you know, it should have about it a kind of claustrophobic attention to that kind of detail. But it is truly a masterpiece.
I want to ask about, you mentioned the orchestra earlier and his attention to all things Asian at this time. How did that carry forth into the orchestra?
Well, first, anytime you play parallel fifths on the piano, then it's going to sound pretty Chinese to you.
Right.
But he goes so far as to include 12 tuned gongs. He has the complete chromatic scale in gongs, and so at appropriate times. They don't play melodies per se, but they certainly play critical color elements in all of the harmonic structure of the piece. And of course, it's a very chromatic piece. This is Puccini at some of his most advanced language, not quite into Fanciulla del West and Turandot, but it is a very richly scored piece. One of the things about singing Puccini is it requires what I call Puccini plushness, and that is not every soprano that can sing Violetta and sing, very works that require certain fullness of voice for projection, have the right color and amplitude of voice to sing Puccini and ride those great waves of sound created by this very big orchestra.
Absolutely.
So it's not, there's hardly anything that he wrote that doesn't have very elaborate and rich orchestration. And in every respect, it's exotic coloring. He was a great orchestrator, and so it has a great richness of sound just by the way he uses the instruments.
Right.
But I'm always fascinated by the colors that he chooses. He'll put in colors like flute and viola and trumpet, all in odd registers playing a unison line, and it's a sound that's almost impressionistic, the way Debussy composed things like that. And it's not the sound we associate with Italian verismo necessarily, which is pretty muscular.
Exactly.
But it's so wonderfully colored in that regard.
One of the things that I think is a difficulty about the role of Butterfly is that often he would do this. His sopranos begin, the same thing happens in Tosca, where the first act you're a lyric soprano, in the second act you're a spinto, and the third act you're a full-blown dramatic.
Right.
And the soprano has to be able to be all three, because the entrance of Butterfly, the offstage singing with the high D flat, that has got to sound like a 15-year-old child.
Exactly.
And then in this score, she actually ages through the opera. And so you hear physically she grows up, and also the voice grows up. And I think Puccini does that in the score as well. Because with the entrance, all the little bells and xylophone and the little delicate, dainty sounds are not in the end.
No, not at all. Then it's taken on the full weight of the drama. And we make the assumption, I think, that everyone knows the story of Butterfly, and as we've alluded to various key dramatic points. To put it in context, yes, we meet her, she's 15 years old, and they go through a wedding ceremony that Pinkerton takes, if not seriously, certainly understands the ritual part of it. And then it's interrupted by Uncle Bonze, who is a Buddhist monk. And he comes roaring onto the stage, highly incensed that he has been to the temple and has found out that Cio-Cio-san has betrayed their culture, that she has taken vows to become Christian. And so for the assembled geishas and relatives and friends of the family, this is shocking news. And so they all turn on her. So if you can imagine at your wedding party, shortly after you've taken the vows, and people are just raising the cup in toast to you, then suddenly it's interrupted by this person who comes in, a relative who comes roaring in and says, you are to be condemned for betraying your homeland. And so people do renounce her. And that renunciation rings through this opera from that point to the very end. And she often says, I can still hear in my head the sounds of those people screaming at me. And so it makes a magical transformation from the denunciation led by Bonze and then the wedding party and family and friends all leaving indignant, screaming at her over their shoulders, to one of the truly great love duets. Right. 18 minutes of just pure ecstasy, at which point I think Pinkerton himself is in love with her. I mean, you could hardly sing that music holding a woman in your arms and not be. And so we are taken to a moment of ecstasy, truly the consummation of this marriage ceremony in the best possible sense, in which he says, don't worry about this disruption of our happiness. Everything's going to be fine. As he carries her into the social for their wedding night. And of course it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. The curtain goes up on Act 2 and it's 3 years later. Right. And there's a bleakness, there is a hollowness, there's a despair. And we don't know where it comes from until Suzuki starts praying and hitting the bells, praying to the Japanese god, saying, please make Butterfly stop crying. And the pain begins. And then as the story unfolds, we realize that Pinkerton left sometime shortly after the wedding. We don't know how long, but let's say a few months later, and has never been back. But he did tell her, just very casually, he'd be back when the robins nest in America. And so she lives now for any little thread of memory of the joy that she thought she had. And she has converted this Japanese home into a casa americana, as she very proudly states. Everything in an American, usually convention now is that she has on some, since we're setting it in 1904, she'll have on Victorian American dress that sets her apart. She says, I'm an American wife. And what has transpired over those 3 years, of course, is that now she has a 2-year-old child. And no one is aware of that until a very dramatic moment. And Suzuki is trying to be the voice of reason, the voice of reality. And she says, Cio-Cio-san angrily turns on her and says, stop praying to those Japanese gods for help for me. The Japanese gods are fat and lazy. You know, you need to be talking to Americans' God. You know, it's this whole capitulation culturally in her mind. Then Yamadori comes. Yamadori is a very wealthy Japanese. He can be portrayed in many, whatever a role of high station would be, a businessman, a samurai warrior, just an aristocrat. And he comes and speaks of his many mansions and his great wealth, and he is fascinated by her and wants to take her for a bride. And she rejects him. She says, I'm sorry, I'm married. I'm an American wife. Sharpless has come with his letter, and he witnesses this. And then when the moment of truth comes, when he has to tell Cio-Cio-san that there's a very good chance that Pinkerton will never return. You should take this offer of Yamadori, where she throws him out of the house. He's indignant. But now, this is an 18-year-old girl who's living solely on marriage. And then the blessed event happens, and that is there's a cannon shot in the distance, the sound she has lived for. They leap to the telescope, look through it, and here comes Pinkerton's ship steaming into Nagasaki Harbor. And she says, I told you people that he was going to come. I told you, go get me my wedding kimono. I'm going to welcome him with exactly the appearance in which he left.
I have to say that the music there, with the canon, is, I think, the most amazing music ever written. It's just spectacular when the trumpets take off there.
Well, and playing also fragments of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is always a sock in the face for American audiences to see how Puccini created the drama of that movie. And that unfolds into truly one of the ecstatic moments, and that's the famous flower duet. You know, in which he says, tutti fiori, bring every flower from the garden. It's just two women bathing in this sea, in this cloud of petals. that represent joy, happiness, life, all of these components. And then she says, now we have to get ready. And so she says to Suzuki, come do my hair and get the baby ready, and because Pinkerton's never seen his child. And
doesn't even know he has a child.
doesn't he? Well, we find out that he got a letter from Sharpless saying, you need to come address the issue of the child. And of course, Pinkerton's decision is that I will take my new wife, my American wife, Kate, with me, and we will go claim the child. And little realizing that this has been the thing, the object, if you will, through which Cio-Cio-san has lived for 3 years. So, so the last scene, there's the occurrence of the beautiful humming chorus as night falls. Talk about some beautiful tone painting.
Unbelievable.
And then we hear the sounds of the harbor, and we hear sailors in the distance, and even the score suggests the clanking of ships' chains, sounds like that, that are nautical in nature. And then the sunrise, and of course, Suzuki has fallen asleep, the baby has fallen asleep, but not Cio-Cio-san. She has stayed awake all night waiting, and then finally she decides she'll take the baby and put the baby inside the house. And these are the few moments in the entire opera that she's off stage, so it's an interesting moment because it leaves Suzuki there when Sharpless leads Pinkerton and Kate Pinkerton onto the stage. And he says, wait in the garden, and Suzuki, going through the house, then sees Kate Pinkerton and realizes instantly what this is, and that this is death for Cio-Cio-san. And so then the narrative unfolds, and Sharpless says, we've come to take the child. And Suzuki said, let me tell her. And so at that point, Butterfly arrives. She has heard the disturbances, she's heard the voices, she thinks Pinkerton has come to sweep her up into his arms and reunite, and instead she runs into the room and looks out in the garden, and there's a woman there. And I think all of the things that Suzuki said for 3 years come crashing in at that moment. And very, very dramatic encounter. And then she says, okay, fine. I'll give you the child, but tell Pinkerton that he must come to me himself in half an hour. So then she goes and commits the deed that is certainly the most famous in the opera. She takes a sword on which is inscribed, you cannot live with, you must die with honor if you cannot live with honor. And this is the sword given to her father by the emperor, for whatever misdeed or misstep or whatever, but she's carried this as one of her treasures, and now it applies to her. And so she traditionally blindfolds the child and then prepares herself, and the ritual of Harry-Carry is then performed in whatever way the stage director chooses to present that part of the drama. But Pinkerton comes rushing in and sees what he has actually done in all of that insensitivity to what Sharpless warned him about at the very beginning of the opera. So.
I can't think of a much more wide span of emotions that you can have in one evening of theater.
That's a good observation. I can't think of any piece that certainly handles it with such cumulative power. Because what I haven't dwelled on is her relationship with the child, which we see so graphically. And when the horror of the decisions that she faces began to become clear to her, she sings, "Tutu piccolo Dio, my little God." Great moment.
It's amazing. I've often seen it, I don't know how they're going to stage it here, but they will have, where Suzuki, knowing what she's doing, will send the child in
Right.
to stop him.
Right.
And to let her realize that, you really do have something to live for.
Right.
And it doesn't change it. I mean, it's interesting that, she fought so long for all these years, and then when she sees that there's this other option, maybe, she gives herself up. It's just terrible. Well, I think this is a show that nobody's going to want to miss.
No,
it's one of the best.
It is one of the greatest operas ever written. The music is beautiful and powerful. The characterizations are engaging. We care about the people on stage.
Exactly.
Particularly the butterfly and the child and Suzuki, and this culture clash that we speak so much about becomes very real, I think, for American audiences in a sympathetic, empathetic way.
Right.
That we wish it was not true, and we wish that it wasn't happening every day today in every culture where soldiers and sailors from every army in the world that are stationed in other places, of course, have interaction. But we can see the same story with American presence in Vietnam, and what came out of that was Miss Saigon, which took the principle of Madame Butterfly and set it in a more modern reference. Changed the characters enough that I don't think we care as deeply about them because they don't bring the same degree of purity to it that we see in Cio-Cio-san. And that's the beauty of the character. This is a 15-year-old girl who was from at least the petty nobility, and devotes herself so totally with purity of heart to this marriage, believing every syllable of truth in his comments about how much he loves her, and making the sacrifice of culture and family and ultimately her life consistent with Oriental traditions of honor.
Well, it's a show not to be missed, Robert. Thank you for talking with me today.